Good morning, evening and afternoon everyone. Today we have an episode of Side Izen. Today we are talking about what is going to come in 10.0.5 in terms of balance tuning for all of the specs. So we, in short, are going to look at all of the changes, the significant changes happening to the specs and how much they are going to change each specs. If we can see some specs rising in popularity, perhaps starting to reach, maybe not flavor of the month, maybe not super OP status, but even, a little bit closer, one step closer to the meta state of a spec that you might want to invite, for example, in Mythic Plus keys. This comes shortly after a couple of rounds of balance tuning in the form of hotfixes, which have already buffed quite a few specs, like Shadow Priest, like Devastation Evoker, for example, like Fire Mage and Frost Mage, for example. So 10.0.5 actually is not buffing nearly as many of the specs. They are more into the style of changing talents, right? Moving talents around, etc., etc. That's the style we are going for in 10.0. Now, what's going to be important in this patch is not just the specs getting changed, but also the specs not getting changed. Because here is the TLDR of the video. These are all of the specs getting changed and by how much. So the first thing you can see is that the majority of the specs, pretty much half, a little bit over half, are not getting changed. However, it varies in importance on who gets changed. Because, for example, if Protection Warrior does not get changed, it's very good for them, because Protection Warrior is OP. So that's exactly what you want to see in 10.0.5, your very powerful spec not getting changed. At the same time, you also see Protection Paladin, and you also see Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example, not getting changed. That's bad. That is bad for them, because they are not very powerful, and even better for Protection Warrior, they can maintain their OP status for sure now, if those tanks don't get changed. The TLDR is that it's good for the powerful specs to not get changed and stay at their current power level, and it's bad for the weak specs, it's bad for the underplayed specs to not get changed, because you want to see changes, you want to see them improving. After we are gone through this disclaimer, we can start looking at the specs getting changed one by one, starting with Druid. Druid gets a whole bunch of general 3 changes, which are mostly forgettable, especially because they don't do anything to make the interrupt easier to take for Resto Druid and for Balanced Druid. So as long as that doesn't happen, most of the general 3 changes for the Druid class are mostly forgettable. The main changes to balance, very importantly, are the fact that now Balanced Druid can get a very easy pathing to an interrupt. Balanced Druids, in case you didn't even know right now, went into Mythic Plus shamelessly without an interrupt, because the 2 talents available to lead up to Solar Beam were terrible for the spec. They were making them lose around 10% DPS if they were to take 2 points to reach Solar Beam, so they would just not take it. Now Blizzard said, okay, fine, we're going to force you. We are going to force you to take the interrupt by putting it right below Starfall and right at the start of your talent tree. So now you are literally forced. You're literally guaranteed that now all Balanced Druids will take an interrupt when you get into Mythic Plus, for example. That is already the main change, the main positive change for balance. Blizzard continues something that we will see throughout these changes to buff underplayed talents. In the case of balance, Astral Communion and Umbral Intensity were 2 undertaken talents which are getting buffed in this patch, just to see in case Balanced Druid will start taking them a little bit more. What is more important for balance is the significant change and buff to Cosmic Rapidity. This is going to change and replace the Circle of Life and Death talent. The TLDR of this change is that previously Circle of Life and Death was giving your dots 25% more damage, but it was making them expire 25% faster. Now, Cosmic Rapidity is simply giving your dots 25% more damage. They won't expire 25% faster. This means you have more time to use other abilities. You have more time to cast other spells rather than spend time redotting because your dots expire 25% faster. There is even a further buff to this. Now Cosmic Rapidity won't even be in the last row of talents for Balanced Druid, meaning that now you have an extra point to spend in the last bracket, the most powerful of your talent bracket, so that's also a very powerful thing. Where is the drawback for balance? The drawback is that now this talent requires 2 talent points instead of the 1 talent point required by Circle of Life and Death. That is a trade-off you have to go for as a Balanced Druid if you still want to take this talent, which you do want to. You have then changes for Feral Druid, which are overall positive, although a little bit more contentious. The mindset of the devs for Feral was to move away some of their dots damage and to move back this damage into Ferocious Bite, which was being sort of ignored once again by Feral Druids. So they have moved some more damage into Ferocious Bite. They have also moved some more options again to try to make Feral Druids change the way they play, or give them more options in the way they play, to make Lunar Inspiration, TLDR, Moonfire in the rotation more viable. Now they dragged it at the bottom of their tree as one of their final talents and buffed it up significantly to try to make it more viable. So we will see if this will end up actually being used by Feral Druids, but at the very least you have some positive changes, some active changes for Feral, which is not something we can say about Guardian Druid. So Guardian Druid at a glance gets a lot of different things. It's the spec that received the most amount of new talents, because Thorns of Iron, Raise, Moonless Night, Lunar Beam are a whole bunch of new talents. Blizzard is playing even more into this Lunar Laser Moon Bear theme for the spec, which is very cool. It's very nice if it worked. If it actually worked properly, it would have been cool to see that. Unfortunately, this type of style is not playing out too well for Guardian, and these changes seems like, at the very least at a glance, won't change too much for the spec. I am still particularly confused at why exactly do we go from this Berserk, giving you 100% cooldown to Trash, and turning you into the classic Guardian Druid spamming Trash and becoming immortal type of style, in giving you a 50% cooldown to Trash in 10.0.5, stopping this thing, essentially no longer allowing you to spam Trash anymore while you are inside of Berserk or inside of Incarnation. That is even more weird in terms of decisions to this spec. So still, even though it was supposed to be positive to see an underplayed tank spec to be changed, the changes are not nearly as beneficial and as optimistic as we would like for this spec. Lastly, we have the very few changes to Restoration Druid. Restoration is getting just a couple of changes to the choice node after Nourish in an attempt to make Nourish more playable. As I said, in a vacuum, by themselves, these two talents, especially one of them, Wild Synthesis, are very, very powerful. Borderline OP if you just look at the raw numbers. Unfortunately, to get all of these powers, the Resto Druid would have to spend 3 talent points to even reach them. So it's unlikely that will actually happen, but at the very least now it's an extra option for Restoration Druid that they did not have before. So we can say overall positive changes for Druid, with the exception of the Black Sheep, or I should say the Black Bear, never mind, of Guardian Druid. We then have changes to Evoker. The changes to Devastation are not here, because Devastation has been giga-buffed before this during one of the hotfixes, so their growth, their possible predicted growth as a very powerful spec in 10.0.5 won't be because of the changes of the patch, but the changes they got before. The only changes are to Preservation, which are somewhat minor. We can't spend that much time talking about them. The TLDR is that Temporal Anomaly. TLDR, what they use in the raid to spread their echoes around, goes from having a 6-second cooldown to having a 15-second cooldown, which significantly nerfs the power of your setups. Your Temporal Anomaly, Echo, 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 Temporal Anomaly, Echo, Echo, and now you have Echo spread to 16 to 18 players before a big Verdant Embrace, Emerald Communion, that type of combo is no longer possible, or at the very least now it's significantly slower, which is quite bad. You do have a payback to this. Now Temporal Anomaly will spread the echoes more or less instantly. You won't have to wait 2 seconds to spread 2 echoes, and then 2 more seconds to spread 2 echoes, and then 2 more seconds to spread 2 echoes. Now you will get your 6 echoes out quite quickly, in just 1 second or 2 with this change, which is going to make it much better when you want to cast only 1 Temporal Anomaly. Still worse when you will have to wait for the second one, because the cooldown now is much, much longer for this ability. It's also somewhat disappointing, I'm sure, for most of the hunters. First of all, to not see any changes to survival, which was in need of them, and also no changes to beast mastery, which was also in need of them. You do have some changes to marksmanship. Now, most of the changes might even end up being a buff overall. However, most of the hunters still won't like this, simply because double tap has been removed from the talent tree. That's what I feel all hunters will look at. Doesn't matter if you tell them that overall these changes are a 4% single target buff and a 6% AoE buff, they will still see their talent tree and not find double tap and be angry. That is what I think is the TLDR. No matter what I tell them, I feel like that's gonna be the result. Now we move to a couple of quite significantly changed specs, starting with Brewmaster. Brewmaster perhaps had the bigger buffs already with the hotfixes, which were these couple of changes, already quite powerful for the defensiveness of the spec. They have, to be perfectly honest, be nerfed in their damage. Don't get baited by all of these damage increases, which also look quite big. Keg Smash, Tiger Palm, Blackout Kick, Spinning Crane Kick, Breath of Fire, basically all of their damage pool of abilities is buffed. That is still not as much damage as the Resonant Fists, which are getting nerfed by 45%. So overall, this nets out to be a damage nerf to Brewmaster, despite all of the buffs to their other abilities. The intention, of course, is clear. Blizzard wants you to do more damage with your abilities and wants you to do less damage with a single boring passive that works all the time, right? That's quite obvious. You have also a whole bunch of buffs purely in the number of talents you can spend. As you can see, all of these talents now, Gift of the Ox, Graceful Exit, Quick Sip, and Staggering Strikes now only take 1 talent point instead of 2, which means if you were taking all 4 of them, now you have to spend 4 talents instead of 8. Which means now you have 4 more talent points to spend elsewhere. That alone is a buff in and of itself. You might as well have read these tuning changes to Brewmaster as Brewmaster now has 4 more talent points than any other spec. And that's how this is for Brewmaster, which is very good. What we do see even further changes, even further buffs though, are to Mistweaver, which is the most buffed spec in the game. If we go from the hotfixes of 1 week, 2 weeks ago to the 10.0.5 patch, Mistweaver received these buffs first, and then all of the buffs of 10.0.5. So things are looking good for Mistweaver, at the very least when it comes to all of the positive changes, plus the talent additions. You're gonna get the very interesting, the very thematic Shaylun's Gift talent with the choice node between Veil of Pride and Shauhao's Lessons, which looks very nice, very, very tuned and very thematic around the Sha powers for a panda from Pandaria. So it looks quite nice to even look at, to even read. However, of course, the final decider will still have to be about how much of this translates into throughput, into actual healing power for Mr. Monk, as they have been lagging behind a bit at the start of this expansion, since the gimmick of Mistweaver had always been I do a lot of HPS. I bring very poor raid cooldowns, very poor utility. I even count as a melee character, which we don't even want in raids, we want as few as possible. So all I bring is HPS. Yet at the start of this expansion, both Restoration Druid and now a new class, a new kid on the block, Preservation Evoker, were both far above Mistweaver in terms of HPS, and even nowadays Holy Paladin is also ahead of Mistweaver. So they had been lagging behind in what was supposedly their strongest tool, their strongest trait, which was HPS. So we will see after all of these buffs to Mistweaver if they will eventually start competing at high levels in terms of healing with the other healers right now. The bad news for Paladin are that Protection and Retribution both have not been changed in 10.0.5. I am saying bad news because Red Paladin and Protection are not really that powerful, and more importantly not really that meta, not really that played right now, so you wanted to see them changed in 10.0.5, which is not happening. Holy Paladin is getting changed, however, not many of the things are changing significantly for Holy. Once again, Blizzard this time takes the route of buffing underplayed talents for the spec. So buffing Avenging Crusader, buffing Tower of Radiance, buffing Inflorescence of the Sunwell, buffing Tears Deliverance. Yes, these are buffs, but at the same time, these were talents not taken by Holy Paladin, and likely continue to want to be taken by Holy Paladin, so are they really buffs if nobody takes these talents? Who knows? As usual, we have a wall of text for Priest, not as much of a wall of text for Holy and for Shadow Priest. Both of them, but in particular Shadow, were already buffed before in hotfixes, in particular Shadow. Shadow is currently one of the specs in line for being a potential underdog / dark horse for 10.0.5 as a new pseudo, perhaps, meta spec, together with Devastation Evoker. They are doing very well right now, in AoE in particular, and in how more tanky they are than their old selves. So not that many changes in 10.0.5 doesn't mean that it's not looking good for Shadow. Holy Priest, however, not many changes and also not particularly buffed previously, besides the 3% buff to all of their healing in a previous hotfix, but the changes in 10.0.5 are not massive. Where we have massive changes are to Discipline. So Blizzard is trying very hard to power up the Shadow version of Discipline, and also they tried quite hard to force Discipline to start playing with Power Word Solace again. They basically introduced Power Word Solace to every single one of the talents which currently buffed Smite, which currently buffed Mind Blast, etc, etc. Now they are also going to buff Power Word Solace, which will make it a near mandatory talent for Discipline. But that's the TLDR for Discipline. Shadow Covenant builds in both Mythic Plus and Raid are far outperforming the non-Shadow Covenant builds. So you can expect to utilize this spell in both forms of content. As if the ramp of Discipline wasn't hard enough and wasn't stressful enough, there is a bit of news for you, Disc players. So you have to start learning something different because you have to start playing with Shadow Covenant now. I think once you go past the annoyance of having to relearn your rotation as a Disc player, it might actually be quite exciting. Not to mention, to be powerful, to be more powerful, supposedly in the 15% healing buff to Discipline right now, but also to start playing a talent which you have considered a meme for several years, for many, many years, and now you actually get to play with it. I think it's quite, I think it would be quite exciting if I were playing Discipline right now. Moving on, we have Rogue. The main changes to Rogue are to Outlaw and Assassination. Assassination gets nerfed mostly because of the change of positions of their talents. Kingsbane being put in the same row of Dragon Tempered Blades is a problem because Assassination wanted to take both of them. And now they can't because they are a choice node. That's all it is. That's literally all it is. In AoE, it might still be somewhat viable because you can still go down the sides, take Dragon Tempered Blades and take your new talent, Arterial Precision, but in single target, in the raid, it's worse. You are just getting nerfed by having no longer the option to take both of these talents at the same time and having to choose one of them every time. Then you have the nerf to Outlaw. Fan the Hammer's additional pistol shots now generate 1 fewer combo points, which is one of the few specs in this whole list of 10.0.5 which actually gets nerfed. That is Outlaw at the moment. Then we have something that unfortunately has become quite the norm. Once again, the amazing changes, they continue. Blizzard is on a roll with this class. The amazing changes to Shaman. After these fantastic changes, we have the few changes to Warlock. Now, these changes are quite boring. Nothing really changes to either Affliction or Destruction, which is quite sad because they were not very powerful, although Destruction is somewhat on the rise. They've also been buffed recently in Hotfixes, but perhaps not nearly as much to make the jump to be a much more viable spec. Affliction is getting buffed by a little bit, Destruction as well. Affliction does get a buff in the 5 to 6% range. Destruction gets basically nothing, just a whole bunch of talents now, also counting Shadowburn as part of their buffs when they previously were not, and Demo basically gets forgotten in this set of changes for Warlock. Lastly, we have Warrior. As we said, bad news for all of the tanks, because the strongest tank in the season right now, Protection Warrior, is not getting touched by nerfs whatsoever. We only have changes to arms and to Fury. Fury gets a few changes, not too many significant ones, only a few buffs actually overall. Once again, a few of these buffs are going to go to underplayed talents in the hopes of giving the spec more options, more choice in their talents. We do see way more changes to the spec that wasn't doing nearly as well as Fury, which is arms. Many of these changes are positive, also to their defensiveness by giving them Ignore Pain in their talent 3, for example, for their defensive power, and a whole bunch of damage increase in their talents, not just to the ones that were underplayed, but also to their currently played talents. They are all getting buffed as well. So this is a good buff to arms. It will unlikely make them stronger than Fury when it comes to Mythic Plus, when it comes to AoE. This is still one of the biggest weaknesses of arms. It has been one of the biggest weaknesses of arms for a long time, but in single target, I believe arms is already at the same level, if not above, than Fury is in many situations. Now, with this change, it is possible that arms will start overtaking over time Fury Warrior, at the very least in this type of content. So positive overall, definitely changes to Warrior for both arms and Fury. So with this being said, as we go back to our initial spoiler of amount of changes given to the specs, we can see that the specs changed a lot, like Mistweaver, Arms and Discipline actually received quite positive changes. But specs with quite a few changes, like Guardian Druid, did not really get that many powerful changes. Even specs with some changes, like Holy Paladin, like Preservation Evoker, or like Marksmanship Hunter, did not really get that many powerful or positive changes, if not getting straight up nerfed, like Preservation Evoker. So all in all, it was quite important to go and look at which specs were getting changed, but more importantly, whether or not the changes they were receiving were actually positive ones or significant ones enough to empower the spec, which has happened to quite a few of them, but not that many. As you can see, still there have been quite a few specs not really mentioned in this patch. Still worth mentioning that many of these specs have received quite large balance tuning changes in previous hotfixes. In the last couple of weeks, for example, Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Red Paladin, Devastation Evoker have all received quite large buffs. So, not being mentioned in 10.0.5 doesn't hurt nearly as much, because you know you already got your buff, you already got your present for January. So, that's what we have for 10.0.5 when it comes to balance tuning, coming in just a few days. At this point in 4 days, I believe, in the next reset, these are the changes we will have to face with. So, I will leave you to your thoughts about the changes to these specs over the weekend. Whatever you think needed some changes and didn't get them, please let me know down in the comments. I have a couple of them I was thinking about, should have gotten a few more changes. I will let you know down in the comments as well. Besides this, it's time to leave each other. As usual, we start our goodbyes by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution, the help to the growth of this channel. You can still, don't worry, support in other ways, not including spending money, liking and commenting down below, of course, and subscribing to this channel are good ways to support for free. You can also support by following me on Twitter right over at this link. That should help myself, but also you, whenever you want to check, you want to be made aware of whenever I go live on my stream, for example, or whenever I have some communications to give out to all of my viewers. That would be the right place to look at. And lastly, it's getting close now. The pain is almost gone. I'm almost fine to be live for quite a few hours in a row. I also stream on Twitch, generally speaking, from 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, oh man, I knew it. It's all ruined. You go to sleep, and then you wake up after 4 hours. The whole day is just fucked.